Hello, everyone. And today we are going to be talking about what types of surgery most increase the value of an injury claim in New York City. I'm Mel McGoyap, and I'm here with the offices of Proner and Proner. And actually, I want to open this up directly to you, Mitch. Can you expand on this, please?
All right. First of all, Mel, welcome to the team. It's good to have you here. It's your first day.
It is.
And already you're filming. So what do you think so far?
So far, so good. I am excited to be here and be able to contribute. And I know that we're talking about some other fun things that you and me have in common, i.e. motorcycles. So that we're going to explore more in the future, of course.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Today, you bring up the topic.
Yes.
What type of surgeries increase the value of an injury claim? Okay. So first, an overview. In order for any injury claim to have value, first of all, you have to sustain injuries and you need to have provable injuries. Now, oftentimes there are myths that surround claims that people will say, and it's happened to me. I've been at parties and I've spoken to people casually, and they find out what I do, and they say, "Oh yeah, I know. My next door neighbor, he didn't even get hurt, and he got $1 million." And that's just a fiction. It doesn't happen. The insurance carriers are big businesses. They make their money by collecting as much as possible in premiums. Then by law, they're required to set aside funds to settle claims that are presented. Those claims are called reserves. And they invest the reserves. So they're making money on their money that by law they're required to set aside by investing those reserves. So the longer a claim takes, the more money they can potentially make by investing those reserves. So they have no interest to pay off a claim really fast, unless they're getting it at a big discount. Now, in order to get fair value, a lawyer or a claimant probably has to put in the time to prove their claim. And the insurance carriers are going to make sure you prove your claim before they make a large payout. They're going to kick the tires on that car before they buy it. So in other words, for an injury claim, first of all, they're going to want to establish that their insured was truly at fault for the incident, or they don't have to pay. Mm-hmm. Second of all, they're going to want you to prove the extent of your injuries. And because today's topics concern with surgeries, naturally, the more life-threatening an injury is that requires a surgery, potentially is going to have a greater value. So first of all, life-threatening surgeries that are needed. If somebody goes into a hospital and they have a bleed on their brain, which is sometimes referred to as a subdural hematoma, sometimes those hematomas, those bleeds on the brain, resolve on their own. Other times, they need to relieve the pressure on the brain, and they'll remove a portion of the skull in a procedure called a craniotomy.
Wow.
So, in terms of brain injury cases, there are closed head injuries. There's an old classification of mild, moderate, and severe brain injuries. They're getting away from those classifications. They find that even without a loss of consciousness, you can have permanent injury.
So actually, Mitch, I actually have an honest question here. Does that typically lead to like higher compensation?
Yes, but not always.
Okay.
The third factor that's involved is And I mentioned the first factor is proving who's at fault for the incident. So, for example, if I, for some reason, get up out of my chair and I go to run out of my office, but because I'm looking somewhere else, I don't notice the door's closed, and I run into the door and I crack my head open and I get a really bad injury, there's nobody to sue because I caused my own injury.
Right.
You need to have somebody at fault for now. I could still have a workers' comp claim because for workers' comp claims, you don't need to prove fault. You just need to show that you're disabled for at least a week. And there's other requirements, like you have to report it to your employer within 30 days. You have to file a claim within 2 years. But for workers' comp, you don't need to prove fault.
Okay.
So under workers' comp, I would be in New York, I would be entitled to 2/3 of my lost wages.
Okay.
And all my medical bills paid, even if I was completely at fault for my injuries. Because I'm in the office and I'm working here, if I ran out the door and hit my head and it was all my fault, I could still bring a workers' comp claim. But you don't get money for pain and suffering in a workers' comp claim. You just get lost earnings and medical bills. For a third-party lawsuit, which could be a multi-million-dollar case, you need to prove fault. You need to prove injury. But the third factor is insurance. Who's going to pay for the damage? So let's suppose I was crossing the street and I got hit by a car. And I have the same brain injury that I described by me running into the door. I crack my head open. There's a bleeding on my brain. And I've got a subdural hematoma. They need to do a craniotomy. They have to remove part of my skull. I can't work as a lawyer anymore. Well, if that car hit me, only had a minimum policy in New York, that's $25,000. And I could say, I'm going to take your home and everything you've got. Well, suppose the guy doesn't have anything. He rents his apartment. He doesn't pay his bills on time. He's living paycheck to paycheck. The car is 25 years old, barely runs, and he doesn't have any savings. His bank account has $6 in it. There are people like that on the road. And if they've got a minimum policy, that $25,000, the insurance company isn't required to pay any more. So despite my head injury, that might be the end. But as it just so happens, I own a vehicle and I have insurance on my own vehicle. And even though I'm a pedestrian, I can bring a claim against my own policies underinsured motorist claim.
Oh.
And now all of a sudden, multi-million-dollar case again because I've got a multi-million-dollar policy and an umbrella on my homeowners.
Right. Wow.
So there's different pockets to look at, but it depends. Now, let's suppose, on the other hand, I'm a poor guy. I'm the guy that, in my hypothetical, I live paycheck to paycheck. I could barely afford to pay my bills. I most of the time pay my bills late. I don't have any money. And I just so happen to get hit by a car. If I'm hit by a rich guy, then he probably has insurance. And the case could be a big case. But if I'm hit by another poor guy that might only have 25, that might be all I could get.
Wow.
And it seems unfair.
Yeah.
But let's suppose it wasn't an injury claim from a motor vehicle collision or a workplace accident. But I got hit over the head with a homeless guy. If I got hit over the head by a homeless guy, I can't sue him. Nobody's gonna get any money out of that homeless guy. It could happen. And the world is unfair at times.
Yeah.
You can hold somebody responsible, but doesn't mean they have the ability to pay you. So that's where insurance comes in, and the minimum in New York for a motor vehicle is 25.
Okay.
Now, if it's a construction accident, typically buildings have more coverage, or a ceiling collapses or something like that. And sometimes you can find coverage where you didn't know coverage existed. For example, I had a client once, happened to be a motorcycle accident. The guy called up his wife after the accident, and he said, "Honey, I think I broke my leg. I'll call you from the emergency room."
All right.
He never spoke to her again.
Oh,
Unfortunately, he had a bleed on his brain and he died.
okay. Wow.
Now, the person that hit him said he was a retired minister, had no money, rented his house, lived paycheck to paycheck, had no savings. His car was 25 years old, and said that was it.
Wow.
But I took his testimony and I said, "Where were you going?" He said, "To visit a friend." "Why were you visiting the friend?" He said, "The friend was sick." I said, "How did you know the friend?" And he said, "Just, longtime friend." And I said to him, "Do you belong to any organizations?" He says, "Yeah, I'm in the American Legion." I said, "Your friend you were visiting, was he in the American Legion too?" He said, "Yeah, he was." I said, "Did you hold a position in the American Legion?" He goes, "Yeah, I was the minister for our charter." I said, "Oh, American Legions have ministers?" He said, "Yeah, ours did." And I said to him, "Were you visiting him as part of your obligations as minister for the American Legion?" He says, "No, I just did that on my own." I said, "Did you announce at the American Legion that you were doing that?" He says, "Yeah, I might have." I said, "Was the American Legion covering any of your expenses?" He says, "Yeah, I think they were paying for my gas."
Oh, wow.
So we kept in the American Legion and became a big case.
Wow.
So sometimes you can find a deep pocket, but let's get back to surgeries.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, like getting back to surgeries, obviously you did mention that, insurance companies treat claims differently depending on the type of surgery. And you did talk about that a bit, but can a recommendation for surgery, even if not yet performed, can it increase the value of a case?
Typically not.
Oh, okay.
Typically not. And the reason for that is this. In injury claims, I only represent the plaintiff. The plaintiff is the one that brings the case. The defendant is the one that defends the case, says, "No, this is not a case." Defendants usually have their defense attorneys paid for by their insurance coverage. And by law, the defense attorneys have the right to call their own doctors as witnesses on their behalf. And they have the right to have their doctors examine my clients. Not because that's my preference, that's part of the claim process. Just as I get to put on my doctor saying my client was really badly injured,
Right.
the other side gets to put on their doctor saying the injuries were not so bad. So let's suppose we have a scenario like you mentioned. My client has a doctor that says he needs neck surgery.
Right.
And my client says, "I know that doctors say I need neck surgery and I'm in terrible pain, but I'm afraid. I heard the surgery's not guaranteed. There are risks involved. Maybe I'll end up paralyzed. I'd rather live with the pain than be paralyzed. I just can't do it." Well, the defense attorney is going to call a doctor, and their doctor, you can be certain, is going to testify, "No. First of all, his problems aren't from the crash. His problems are from aging, and they're normal problems just related to the degeneration in his neck, arthritis and osteophytes, and conditions that occur over time, that could have developed since this recent accident. So, first of all, his problems aren't related to the crash. Number two, he doesn't need any surgery. So now a jury's going to hear two sides. One side says injuries are bad and he needs a surgery. The other side says he doesn't need any surgery. And a jury's going to think needs it, doesn't need it, needs it, doesn't need it, needs it, doesn't need it. Well, if he really needed it, he would have gotten the surgery. And because he didn't get the surgery, he must not need it. So they're not going to assign the same value to it. Now, if you have the surgery, their doctor could say the surgery wasn't necessary. And your doctor's going to say, yes, it was. I was in there. I looked at the conditions. I actually went in there. I'm a surgeon. I looked at it. He needed it. And the jury's going to say necessary, unnecessary, necessary, unnecessary, necessary, unnecessary. Well, if he didn't need it, he wouldn't have gotten the surgery. So we have to believe he needed it. He couldn't live with the pain. So the case becomes worth more by virtue of having the surgery. And then their doctor's just left to say, well, he made a good recovery. Now he's much better. And the jury would be thinking, he might be better, but you don't go back to the way you were, never having needed the surgery. So the claim is worth more money. So that's just the way it is. You might need a surgery, but if you don't get it, it might not necessarily increase the value of your claim.
So based on what you were mentioning about the other case, like the motorcycle guy, is it advisable, instead of like calling your friends or family, should you call 911 right away or wait, or what is probably the best approach for that?
Well, more important than any money I ever get any client is your health.
Yeah.
Because I could get a client a lot of money and maybe he blows it in a year. No matter how much. Believe it or not, people could go through a lot of money. They give it away to their neighbors, their friends. They put it in investments that they think are going to do well. I bought a laundromat. How could I lose? Well, you lost. So you had no experience running laundromats. Just because you settled a big case doesn't mean you're going to become an entrepreneur.
Right.
But believe it or not, people can burn through a lot of money.
Yeah.
At the same rate, your health's forever.
Yeah.
Your health is forever. You could have money, you could lose it, you can make it again, you can lose it again, you can make it again. Donald Trump, I think, was bankrupt 40 times.
Wow.
Supposedly he was in terrible financial help and in need of tremendous help until he had that show, The Apprentice, and that saved him.
Yeah.
Who knows? Now he's obviously wealthy, but your health is forever. So the first thing you should do is, whether or not you think you need help, you should get help. If you have any concerns that you might have been injured, you should get yourself checked out, because that can make a big difference. We're talking about a brain injury. There's a thing called neuroplasticity, where if a brain is subject to injury, its recovery and its ability to heal itself, doctors refer to as neuroplasticity, and that can be impacted by the therapy you immediately receive. You might not even realize the severity of your head injury. Let me get to the other types of surgery.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Please do. Please do. Yeah. Actually, I think another one of our questions that we had here is like, what happens if I or you need surgery, but the insurance policy isn't enough to cover it? Can you expand on that, please?
Okay. So sometimes there might be insurance that will cover it, but they don't want to. Like, for example, workers' comp denied it. Sometimes you have a third-party claim and a workers' comp claim, like in my example of a construction accident. You might have a workers' comp case because you got hurt while you were working, and a third-party claim because you're suing the owner of the building where you were working or the GC. Maybe you're entitled to different compensation depending on how the incident occurred. Sometimes your insurance might not want to cover it. Or let's say a motor vehicle accident, you get $50,000 in no fault. That's supposed to cover your medical bills and your lost earnings, 80% of your lost earnings up to $2,000 a month. Motorcycles are excluded from no fault, but cars have no fault insurance by law. So maybe no fault is exhausted. There's no more money there. In some cases, you could get a funding company, which is ethical in New York, but not advisable. And I'll explain that in a moment. You can get a loan against the proceeds of your lawsuit to pay for the surgery. Now, if you can get your insurance to pay for it, let's say the workers' comp, rather than a lending company, you're better off doing that. Because on a workers' comp case, when you settle the third-party action, that means the lawsuit, apart from you got to pay back the money you got from comp, but you only pay back 2/3. If you get a lending company to give you money for the surgery, not only do you have to pay back the money you got, but the interest could be 32% annual, which you might think is an illegal lending agreement. It's usurious, but it's not, because it's a non-recourse loan. If you lose your case, you don't have to pay it back. So ethically, the Attorney General in New York has determined these agreements are ethical, but there's a big cost to it. So you don't want to get the lending if you don't have to.
There's any, like, if you're likely to need additional surgeries, I mean, can you settle the case before undergoing them?
You can.
Okay.
But that additional surgery, if your doctor says you need additional surgery and you didn't get it, you might not get the value from that surgery, as I mentioned, because they'll have a doctor that says you don't need it, even though you're going to get it in the future. And additionally, your case is going to be worth more immediately once you had the surgery. So you're better off getting all your surgeries before you settle your case. But if you're going to need surgeries for the next 30 years, you don't want to keep the case open for 30 years. You need to move the case.
Wow. Okay. Wow, that was a lot of fantastic information, Mitch. Like, I mean, before we close off this segment of Tuesdays with Mitch, do you have anything else you want to add on?
Yeah, I only talked about one type of surgery, and there are other surgeries. Let me give you a quick list of
please do.
Surgeries that might affect the value of your claim. So underneath a craniotomy, of course, amputations, depending on the limb that's amputated, an arm or a leg, tremendous value. A finger, less valuable, of course. If somebody said to me, would you rather lose a finger or your arm? I would say take off the finger. And that's the same thing with the value of a claim. After amputations, neck and back surgeries. But then there's different levels of surgeries in the neck and back, and there's also different types of surgery. So a microdiscectomy is not as valuable as a laminectomy infusion, where they make a larger incision, they go in and they might put in some hardware. They might do allografting, where they take parts from a cadaver. Those are worth more than just a microdiscectomy. Then you've got arthroscopic surgeries, knees, shoulders, where they just go in they make 3 small cuts, and they go in and they could do a little drilling in there or a little clipping in there. They could do debridement, which is where they just clean out some damaged tissue. And they actually go with the scope. That's why they call it arthroscopic. And the doctor's actually looking inside the joint. Those are surgeries. They still add to the value of a claim, but not as much as an open surgery with a larger incision.
Okay.
Whether they're done under general anesthesia or local anesthesia, general anesthesia typically is greater value than local anesthesia. And the more invasive the surgery is, typically the more it's going to add value to the claim. And that's the last I have to say on the topic. And hopefully you never need a surgery, and hopefully you never need a lawyer. But if you do, it's important to get a lawyer that's experienced and knows what they're doing. And fortunately, at Proner & Proner, we definitely know what we're doing. And I've been doing it over 30 years, and I love helping people out. I enjoy my work. I never wish an accident on anybody, But I hope if they have an accident or an injury, they'll call us, because at least we know what we're doing and they're going to be in good hands. We don't do divorce. We don't do criminal. I try to get people lawyers that do if they call us on those claims. But for injury claims, I've handled cases in over 30 jurisdictions, and I've lectured literally around the world. I've lectured in Europe, I've lectured in Canada, and across the United States to attorney groups on how to handle these cases. And to consult with us is always free and confidential. And hopefully you never need us. And welcome to the team, Mel, and I'm glad to have you.
I'm happy to be here, and yeah, fantastic information. I know I personally learned a lot even now, and I'm sure, and I hope many of you have learned a lot even with this segment. It's called Tuesdays with Mitch, right?
I do believe it is.
I just want to make sure.
And I think you're in the right place.
Fantastic. I wasn't too sure. Right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mitch. For all of you just tuning in or watching or listening on the podcast, please, a friendly reminder to subscribe, like, follow all our social media channels. And of course, Mitch is very great with reminding that everything is a free consultation and it is confidential. And please feel free to call us at 1-800-321-1234. You can't deny how catchy that is. Well, I guess that's it for now, Mitch. I really appreciate the time, and I'm sure your viewers and listeners really do appreciate this moment with you. So until next week, guys, don't hesitate to call Proner and Proner.
Thanks so much, Mel. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Bye-bye.
My name is Zach Gordon. I was on my motorcycle on my way home from work on the LIE when someone in a van swerved over the double-sided line of the HOV lane and hit me, and I took a pretty gnarly tumble. I ended up fracturing a bone in my wrist. I had a concussion as well as nerve damage in my right arm, but the worst injury was probably the ruptured disc I had in my neck, which ended up requiring spine surgery. I had the disc replaced and whatnot. In that meantime, I posted about the accident, letting some friends I had on Reddit know about what happened and whatnot. And a random person, reached out to me and said I had an accident as well, and Proner and Proner really helped me out for much more minor injuries than you. So I think you'd have a good case with them. And next thing I know, I reached out to Proner and Proner and was almost immediately put in touch with Mitchell the same day. From that point forward, it was super simple. I signed the retainer, gave any medical professionals I saw my attorney's information, and I had to speak to my attorney maybe if even once a month, once every 2 months. And next thing I know, in quite literally less than a year, the case was already over with a very, very good settlement. Essentially set me up for the future, and I'm very, very grateful to Mitchell Proner and the rest of his, I suppose, employees at Proner and Proner. And I would absolutely recommend this firm to anyone that has been in a similar situation or scenario as me, or if anyone you may know, this could not have been an easier and more desirable outcome and process.